Buhari. Now, before the passage of the appropriation bill spending plan, it was 20.51 trillion naira, but it was raised at the end of the day to 21.82 trillion naira. And while we await the president's assent, there are questions around funding level of deficits and the implementation strategy of the budget. Meanwhile, the Senate and the House of Representatives have also approved 819.5 billion naira as supplementary budget for the year 2022. What exactly are the concerns, worries, the red flags, especially as senators kick against the request by President Buhari to approve 23.7 trillion naira already spent by the federal government without the National Assembly approval? Well, let's get to discuss this and paint a picture of what this looks like. Let's look at the fundamentals of the 2023 spending plan. My guest is the Managing Director and Chief Business Officer at Optimus by AfriInvest, Mr. Ayodeji Ebo. Compliments of the season. Thank you so much for joining us. We really appreciate this.
Yeah, good afternoon. Compliments of the season, and thanks for having me.
My first question will be this. Amid rising deficit, the National Assembly is increasing the budgetary size by 1.38 trillion naira, about 1.3 trillion naira, hitting 21.8 trillion naira from 20.5 trillion naira. First, what do you think will be responsible for this at this time?
Okay, thanks. I think it's rather worrisome because even looking at the proposed budget of 20.5 trillion against a projected revenue of about 10.7 trillion, that in itself, it's a tall order because when you look at budget performance year on year, even as an August, when you project the revenue, it's really going to be less than 10 trillion that is even being projected for 2023. So with the increase of about 1.3 trillion, I think 800 billion in supplementary and the 500 billion increase, this further puts pressure on the government. So when you look at the budget in detail, so breaking down even the expenditure, so there are some that government will not have any choice than to first focus on. So when you look at debt servicing, which is about 6.3 trillion, that is almost 80% of the projected revenue. So when you look at the actual, because it's always good to compare to what has happened in the past, looking at this year's performance, you would see that the actual revenue, or I would say the debt servicing, is almost at par with the actual revenue. So it means that this year in itself, we have borrowed to finance other expenditure, both capital and non-debt recurrent expenditure. It means we have borrowed to support that, either support from the CBN or going to the market to borrow. So that in itself makes the budget ineffective because the more the borrowings, the less effective the budget, because most of the actual revenue that you would get will be going into non-productive areas because you are trying to service your debt to keep up to your expectation or obligations rather.
Interesting start there. Mr. Ebo, let me ask you about some of the assumptions here now. Let's start with oil benchmark, which has been increased from $70 to $75 per barrel. And also our daily production pegged at about 1.69 million barrels. Exchange rate, 435 naira to $1. How realistic is this?
Okay, thanks. And I'll take it one after the other. So the one we saw that was adjusted by the Senate was the oil benchmark from $70 per barrel to 75. I think it's also rather optimistic because we've also seen that a lot of the economy suffered from the rise in oil prices, crude oil prices globally, and they are looking for alternative to ensure that that will not happen in 2023. So putting it at 75, it's like we are over projecting the actual amount. The crude oil prices falls below that amount. It means there will be a shortfall. it would have been better to be conservative and have like what we call a windfall, have excess, which will give you opportunity to focus on other things. But that has been passed. We're all just waiting for the president to assent his signature, which perhaps will happen today, based on the past trend. And but also looking at the production, that is also a bit concerning on its own, looking at what the performances have been. So when you look at even the actual oil production, ranges between 1.2 million barrels per day, about 1.4 even at its peak for this year. And we have not seen, is there any major thing that would change that would enable us to achieve that 1.6? There's nothing in the pipeline that we expect that to change. So when you look at oil revenue in itself, that says that government is projecting about 2.4 trillion naira from oil revenue, which means that would suffer significantly like we saw in 2022. There was significant gap in oil revenue. So it's really very clear that that will put more pressure. So when you're now looking at the total projected revenue, once you are picking one line, the oil revenue, and there's also this line of revenue that government continues to over project, independent revenue. When you look at the performance, always less than 50%. Government is projecting about 2.2 trillion naira from that part. So if you want to look at what the realistic revenue would be around maybe 8 trillion, comparing it to about 21.8 trillion. So it means that the deficit would be around 12 to 15 trillion at the end of the day. Where would this fund also come from? And that's going to be that very concerning. And to wrap up, the last one, which is the exchange rate. Yes, so looking at the trend, most times what government would always use not to trigger panic or is always the CBN rates. So I won't speak much on that. It's just based on the standard. And since there's nobody projecting or allowed to projecting where it would go, so they will typically stick with what the current interbank rates or NAFEX rate is saying.
Sad. That is really something that should be looked into as we move into the new year, addressing that challenge in that FX market. I'm always worried about that disparity between the iron in window and, of course, the other market, the parallel market. But let's move on. We have statutory transfer at 967.4 billion naira, debt service at 6.5 trillion naira, and recurrent expenditure at 8.232 trillion naira. Capital expenditure at 5.97 trillion naira. This is a budget that will transition, that will see a transition of government. We expect an election in February and handing over in May. So it's a budget that will be carried on by new sets of policymakers, government. Do you think that, what's the actuality, yes, in this? Do you see it being so seamless, talking about infrastructure projects that are on, talking about all of the initiatives that have been introduced already by the past administration?
Okay, thanks, and very valid question. I think the what would be in the mind of every Nigerian and even the concern for government is, where would the money come from? We are talking about 21.8 trillion. So it's easy for us to call these numbers, but how will the funding be done? When you also look at, I spoke earlier that deficit may be between 12 to 15 trillion. And where I mentioned earlier that even the Senate, in terms of restructuring the existing ways and means from the CBN, and that was, I think, was postponed, which is about, I think, for 40 trillion, restructuring that for 40 years rather. So that means that if CBN slows down in its support for the government, then there would be significant borrowings. And when you also look at the borrowings, you look at the gap relative to the available liquidity, you look at the PFA assets, it means that if we don't get significant support from the CBN, government would have to borrow at a very high rate. We all know that the international market is a no-go area given the high yield now. So the focus would be to borrow domestically. But also, when you analyze critically what we should expect with all this spending, so the recurrent expenditure, which is about 8.3 trillion, as mentioned, that's almost like 40% of the total budget. Yes, we know that personnel cost is always part of it, but if we actually want to be very productive, we need to look into that single figure. Apart from the personnel cost, because most times when you touch on personnel costs, most people were not saying go and downsize, but that should not be the first step, way to start. But it means that there are a lot of duplications, leakages, because it's the cost of running the government is significantly is higher. So what the total other populace benefit from, which is the capital expenditure, which is about 5.9 trillion, based on based on the new figure. It means that about less than 5% of the population are enjoying about 50% of the total budget. Also, it is the capital expenditure that will translate into even improved ease of doing business and increased government non-oil revenue. So you would see the reason why it's been difficult to grow non-oil revenue. And what we're seeing is trying to look at other avenues to tax those that are paying, look for avenues to increase taxes, because production is not increasing, business activity is not set to overhaul that expenses. So if you look at recurrent expenditure, both debt and non-debt, will account for about 73%. So just capital expenditure is about 26, 27% of the total budget. That in itself, when you look at the actual, most times it may fall within the range of 15%, because it's always the last to be touched when there are order pending, because government will first want to honor its obligation of fulfilling its debt servicing. They also don't want to hold salaries, and some of the spendings, even if there's no revenue, they will look for a way to ensure that that is done. So at the end of the day, the portion that is always at the receiving end is the capital expenditure.
Now, many say the president, of course, looking at the increase and understand what that stands for. But my question now would be that for a country that have had series of plans, we had economic growth and recovery plan at a particular time. We had economic sustainability plan, I think, during the COVID-19. And now we have the National Developmental Plan. For my question now will be, how do we synchronize all of this with the actualization of our spending plan? Because I think we have a lot of plans, but implementing them seems to be what we keep talking about.
Yeah, so I think you have even answered that. Our problem is not formulating policies. Our major problem is implementing. So as we are expecting a new CEO in 2023, the expectation is that the willpower is about implementation. If not, we're already going down a very scary terrain, because when you look at the sustainability of our budget, the borrowings, how it's going, very soon we'll be borrowing to repay the loan, which if we do proper analysis of this year, we might have already got into that. It means we would see that we would have to borrow to repay these loans, which is very significant. But if we are able to implement these policies, creating enabling environment, creating support for the SMEs that will generate enough non-oil revenue, then we will begin to see improvement. You know, we all got, when we report that, yes, we're in a positive, our growth rate is positive at about 2.1%, but for the economy to improve, for standard of living to improve, for it to be inclusive, we need to grow above 5 economies. There's a need to be deliberate, and there's a strong correlation between the lower poverty level and insecurity when you also throw in the variable unemployment. So if there's no production, if companies are not expanding, and you are getting new people to join the labor market, the unemployment will increase, And if there's no job, insecurity would increase. And this is also as a way of feeding back into private investment. Once insecurity is high, nobody wants to set up factory, nobody wants to invest in your country. And as a result, what government tends to get in terms of revenue would be low. Non-oil revenue would even be low. We can see that even the revenue from oil is also depleted beyond the production that is depleting. There's reduced investment in that space, which will impact on some of the royalties that should be collected within that space. So there's a need. We're all hoping and with, yes, with a bit of caution that we expect that any of the new CEO that emerge would focus on implementation and not just formulating new policies. We don't get, Nigerians don't get excited about these policies. It is when we implement, even if we can implement up to 50% of this strategy, we will see that deliberate, that improvement in terms of approaching that growth trajectory that we all hope for.
Before I let you go, Mr. Bo, the argument in some quarters is that this is, of course, a global issue. They will tell you that in the UK, things are not looking too good, hiking the energy prices. We know what's been happening, government trying to subsidize and help the masses. And some will tell you that the war in Russia and Ukraine is also impacting the African continent. And they will say that's the reason why we must borrow, at least before we get out of what we face at this time. But what do you think about the impact of all of these global issues? And it's a two-in-one question. Finally, what are the quick wins for job creation and inclusiveness in Nigeria? Thank you.
Okay, thanks. I think, maybe most people are just being sarcastic about it. We will look at, when we looked at the oil sector, it is not Russia and Ukraine war that triggered oil theft, such that we are unable to sell and we were unable to benefit. This year is supposed to be one of our best years because oil price went above 100 naira per barrel, but due to oil theft, we're not benefiting from it. So I think when we're comparing with our situation is very peculiar in Nigeria. It's different from when you also look at in terms of the policies, what are the palliative, the support, apart from the CBN. CBN is doing its bit, but there's a limit to what it can grow. There's a limit to the proportion of intervention fund that can be given relative to the economy from the CBN angle. There needs to be policy that will enable private sector. Insecurity increased, kidnapping increased, and as a result of that, you see farming, a lot of it affected farming, it affected production, it affected investment, and as a result, that led to significant unemployment in the country, which is what we're suffering. So what are the first have that willpower to ensure that we want to implement. Then you identify what are those sectors that we feel that can trigger the manufacturing sector, the trade sector. There needs to be reforms that will support. The SME is the major driver. What kind of support are we giving that those particular sectors? And when we spoke about the recurrent expenditure that will be spent, if we can ensure that these things are being spent, most of it are spent within the economy, the multiplier effect would also be higher and not spent on imported products so that we are developing other economies. So if we're able to focus, if there are policies like that, when you look at in the past, the time when, say, the cars that will be used by officials of the government must be Nigerian, begin to localize and increase our local content, and we're deliberate about it, that would really go a long way in boosting productivity and increasing employment. Then the second quick win is insecurity. If we're able to tackle insecurity, productivity will increase, food production will increase, and that will bring down even inflation. And we'll be able to even generate more effects that would impact on the FX inflow that we're doing and reduce the depreciation of the FX. So those are the initial quick wins that if those things are done, and we would attract foreign investment, because there's a limit we can see with the budget. Government is not going to be able to finance anything meaningful. It is the private sector that will be able to help us in financing this. But if there's no conducive environment, then we'll continue to suffer and the little resources will be pressured.
He's the managing director and chief business officer at Optimus by Afri Invest. Thank you for your contribution all through the year. It's really significant and we don't take it for granted. Do have a happy new year. We hope to chat with you as we move on in the year. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. Always my pleasure to be on this show. Thank you.
All right, then. Well, it's a great one there. Well, coming up on the show, we'll